Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. I am your host, Mylan Tatusis, coming at you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, Treaty 6 territory. This episode has been brought to you by our new Patreon subscribers, Amanda, Caitlin, and Elise. Thank you for your contribution. Today on the episode, I'm sitting down with Dr. Gina Starblanket, coming at us from the University of Victoria, however, has her roots down in Treaty 4 territory. Listen in as we talk about treaties in context to this side of the border, nation-to-nation agreements, and the embedded capitalism that exists in the political relationships today. If you like this episode and all other episodes, please like, subscribe, and share. And remember that if you do follow us on Patreon and financially contribute to this podcast, you get to attend the monthly coffee house where we come together and discuss our episodes and all things going on in the world. It's usually a fun time. We get to discuss and share knowledge. So go ahead and check out our Patreon, pick a tier that you like, and if you pick the right one, you'll be getting a monthly link to the monthly coffee house. This was a smooth episode. I just finished recording it 15 minutes ago, and I'm bringing it to you now. So be sure to stay tuned and listen in. Okay, we're recording. Awesome. Thanks for making time for sitting with us, Gina. You've been on the list for a while. Like, we wanted to reach out to you in the past, in particular about storing violence and on that conversation. Yeah. But there's some episodes we're saving for in person, and but you know, with the times and everything right now, we felt like, well, let's reach out and see if she wants to sit with us and have a conversation.
Yeah, of course. Always happy to chat.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll ask you to introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, and what you do.
All right. So I'm Gina Starblanket. I'm from the Star Blanket Cree Nation, but I didn't grow up on reserve. I grew up in Regina, which is about an hour away. And I grew up in Regina, did my undergrad there in political science, and then actually, we met, and I did my grad work out at UVic with the political science and Indigenous governance programs. And then I've sort of gone around teaching at a few different institutions since that time. So I taught at the University of Manitoba, U of C, and now I'm back at the University of Victoria as an associate professor teaching in the Indigenous governance programs and working to restructure those programs moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah, both iGov alum, technically. Right? Yeah, we've both been there.
A lot of connections, I feel like, that people make, and that's tend to endure.
Yeah, it is. And I feel like it gets smaller, like the higher levels you go up in terms of academia, like the world gets smaller. So everyone knows everybody, it seems.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. One of the questions we're starting to ask our guests too is like origin story, self and family. Partly because obviously, as our guests know, and if they follow us on social media, that there's the big pretendian conversation going on, right? So we had some recommendations for people to ask questions about, where they come from, their family in terms of like heritage and family story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like I said, I'm from Star Blanket, which means I'm a member there, but I'm Cree and Saulteaux on my mom's side, and I'm French and German on my dad's side. So it's a really interesting upbringing where, I spent a lot of time with my mom, going with her to her, she was doing her undergrad at the time at what was then the Sask Indian Federated College.
Yeah.
So went with her a lot while she would work for our band and with local organizations, and when she was doing a lot of teaching in Indian studies. And those were sort of like the early days of still the early days of Indian studies, where I feel like people were talking about, Native history and culture, but weren't really talking that critically about colonialism yet. Yeah. However, there was a really strong steeping in my community. Like, treaty has always been really, really significant and transformative for, as I think an idea and a practice that a lot of our leaders have really based themselves in. So I always had a really strong interest in treaty, but then that was really contrasted to, what I would hear about treaty at school, both in elementary and secondary levels, because I went to a French Catholic school. And so there was a lot of really interesting sort of narratives about Indigenous people and indigeneity that circulated there, because it was such a small, Francophone community. There is a weird, I should say weird, but there's a particular relation between the French and Indigenous people in the prairies, and like a almost form of identification with Métis-ness, which was always kind of complicated and confusing for me because I grew up knowing I was Cree, or knowing myself as Cree. And so being at the school where, I don't know, they sort of embraced this Métis identity, it was really complex for me, and one I had to kind of reckon with throughout my childhood. But yeah, I mean, in terms of going back to I think some of my early interests in the work that I do, our chief who took Treaty 4, who signed Treaty 4, Chief Star Blanket, was my great grandfather, and he was our inaugural chief after signing Treaty 4. So he the band was named after him, but he was the son of our band's original chief, Wapamustasis, who translates to white buffalo calf. So Wapamustasis was one of the Plains Cree chiefs who signed Treaty 4 in 1874. And then, he died shortly after taking treaty, and Chief Star Blanket was our first chief, and was in middle age at the time, and really dedicated himself to implementation of the treaty, and had a long history, that I'm able to hear about from elders, but also see, records in the archives of his resistance to what the government was seeing as treaty implementation or non-implementation at the time.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah. I love the positionality too, because very similar up here where I grew up, Treaty 6 territory was, where I still live, obviously. But yeah, growing up hearing about, the Peace and Diplomacy Project, the Nationhood Project, that, we were going to engage in good relations, with settlers coming into the territory, and ultimately even the settler state, and ideally, build a unique world. And that was the intention, right? So there's also like this big misconception amongst, some people that say, well, treaties are land surrenders, or treaties were, you giving in to colonialism. But that's not the case, right?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And that's what I think early on, I sort of developed this interest in narrative and the power of, what we say and why that matters, right? Words matter. They have an impact. And, even as early as elementary school, I would hear, a lot being said about Indigenous people, and, you sold the land, or you got a bad deal, get over it. But that was, really basically just the exact opposite of what I heard about what treaty was at home, and what it represents and stands for and entails, and in the present and moving forward. So I think that gap to me, and that disconnect, was really interesting. And then, throughout the work that I've tried to do, I've tried to kind of really hone in on and explore that gap.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously this myth still sort of endures today, right? Like a lot of settlers will assume that, oh, you did sell the land, or it's no longer yours. So all this like myth of surrendering, or, even being conquered, which doesn't even apply to Canada because we didn't engage in any sort of official war against Canadians. That's more of like a US narrative. But yeah, a lot of like the work you're doing is to address that and speak to that, and, highlight the truth and reality of who we are as Indigenous people, invested in a peace and diplomacy project.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it has been to try and sort of counter those myths, and then also show that they're not just operating at the level of symbolism. Like there is an actual material damage that happens when they're reproduced. And we saw that in the trial of Gerald Stanley, right? Where treaty doesn't really form part of that logic or the foundation of what, justice looks like at all in, if you can even call it justice, which I would say you can't. But in that context, right, treaty doesn't get brought up at all in that trial, despite the fact that, that's actually the agreement, the ongoing agreement through which settlers claim and attempt to legitimate their presence in the prairies. And so I don't see how, you can actually have something that you're even going to try and call justice. That's that sort of, embedded in one unilateral conception of justice that from its origins was based on and for it was based on Indigenous people's subordination, but for Canada and its own citizens, right? So I don't think, for me, the continuity of those myths, the impact of those myths is really apparent. And so if I can try and draw that out, that's an important enough task, for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I really like your work. I like what you're doing. And in my mind, you're the treaty scholar that's out there, one of the treaty scholars out there that I like to refer to and make reference to. But there's a few out there. And that's why I wanted you on here, was to speak to and put voice to the very important, like, nationhood, treaty, sovereignty conversation. But I also want to take a step back and simply give our listeners who aren't familiar with this conversation, like just a working definition of what is a treaty in context to our conversation here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think I would say, like anything, it's terrible probably interviewing academics, because we never want to give a straightforward answer to anything. And so like anything, I would say it sort of depends where you're coming from and how you're understanding it. So, treaties sort of bear this complicated and ambivalent relation to the territories that are now claimed by Canada, right? And so what I mean by that is that, in a sense, and to, the architects of colonialism, they have represented an imperial and, in fact, very specifically colonial device, meant and geared towards land dispossession, geared towards legal and political subordination of Indigenous peoples, but mostly as a sort of mechanism to dispossess Indigenous people of our rights to land. Through the sort of guise of, diplomacy and, consensual, nonviolent relationship building. So that's sort of what they entail for settlers, but particularly, I think, those who employed them in the early days of colonialism and have continued to kind of draw on the image or rhetoric of treaty, right, in relation to Canada's origin, that they're these sort of devices that facilitated peaceful settlement and development. For Indigenous people, I think, it's more complicated than that, because they definitely precede, our interactions and encounters with settlers. They represent one of our longest standing diplomatic practices and mechanisms for negotiating coexistence in shared spaces, right? And so we have these very rich, long-standing histories of people arriving on our shores and in various ways, and being able to speak to them across difference and enter into these really complex agreements that mean a great deal, both historically and in the contemporary sense, to Indigenous people. Mostly, though, in terms of, and again, I'm not going to sort of make, generalized claims about every treaty and what they share, because they're all, very specific, while still sharing some general qualities. But I think, the one shared conception for many people in the prairies is that we regarded them as agreements to share the land, right? To negotiate use of the land and the sharing of the land. And that was very, very particular about, to what depth it would be shared, that it didn't regard, or it didn't entail ownership. It didn't entail, shouldn't entail restrictions on our existing ways of using the land as Indigenous people, right? That we wanted, to continue to be able to use our land while agreeing to share it with newcomers. And so by and large, that's what, treaties represent, I think, both to settlers and to Indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how you did both perspectives there, right? Because that's always what we navigate to, especially as scholars and people, like even in terms of lecturing the treaty component in Indigenous studies. It's always like these two worldviews clashing and these two different interpretations always sort of, existing. But I also like what you said in terms of even in the earlier days, like, Indigenous people in North America having treaties with other people coming across the ocean. One of the things I like to highlight, and I really want to highlight for our listeners, is that if you look at that just in terms of the bare bones relationship, that is a form of international diplomacy that was being implemented very early on in terms of colonialism and the relationships that were going to unfold. And that tends to shift students thinking about it, because then I start to speak to our people as being, basically capable of international diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, these matters are always taken up within the frame of Canadian politics, but they could be taken up and should be, within international relations as well, on the study of political science.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then also, I want to narrow this down because you also position that, there's different treaties, obviously in North America. Like for our American listeners, look into it stateside. Look what's going on. Even internationally, there's treaties between different colonial powers and things like that. But I really want to narrow this down in terms of Canada, in terms of, in particular, Treaty 1 to 11. What is Treaty 1 to 11, and why are they important in context to the modern relationship with Canada today?
Yeah, so treaties 1 to 11, they really, what they're going to do is follow the sort of pre-Confederation model of treaty that gets established really, by the Crown at the time through the Royal Proclamation. So we have, very early on, Canada laying out what it calls a treaty process in the interest of ensuring that it's the only party that can acquire land from Indigenous people. And so articulates a number of principles around how it approaches treaty making in the Royal Proclamation. And this model eventually is what's going to unfold and evolve into the formula for what people will call the post-Confederation or numbered treaties, which are the series of treaties that are negotiated in the late 1800s, so between 1871 and 1921. And those are the treaties that cover, the portion, the majority of the prairies, beginning in Ontario, all the way over to portions of BC and into the north as well. And so these are treaties where Canada is essentially, having negotiated over parts of Ontario and Quebec earlier on, is going to now, as it's shifting from the fur trade over to, the development of permanent settlements and different forms of economy, is going to try and secure that land incrementally going west. And so we see this series of treaties as Canada aims to, quote unquote, open up that land for development and really secure access in order to undertake a number of different economic initiatives and infrastructure initiatives that it thinks will be sort of crucial to the new settler colonies' viability moving forward. So that's where we start to see this move towards, really restricting Indigenous peoples' movements or mobility through the Indian Act, and trying to essentially contain the geographies that we're able to inhabit in order to open up those spaces for settlement and agricultural development, or whatever form of resource development is being envisioned in that geography.
Yeah, and you made this important distinction there in reference to the Royal Proclamation. So, like the British Crown having this sort of like this law come into play where they're the ones that would have to negotiate a relationship with Indigenous people, not the average Canadian settler or the average colonist who's living in North America. And you also made this cool distinction where you said that Canada started to move forward with wanting to take this land. So it's almost like three parties in this relationship that need to be distinguished. I feel is you have the British Crown, you have the Indigenous people, and then you have the Canadian state that's sort of locked into this relationship with us, and they don't like it. Like Canada tends not to like it ever since, John A. Macdonald, right? And because their hands are tied basically to our table.
Yeah, and they've negotiated this series of agreements at this point then that really, they wouldn't have had to negotiate if they didn't also recognize some form of rights to the land, which also, the Royal Proclamation, scholars will debate whether it's to what extent it recognizes and actually seeks to protect Indigenous rights to the land. As early as the 1700s, right, people are having these debates in Europe and, in spaces in Canada as well, around what Native rights actually entail and what, settlers' obligations are to protect them and uphold them. And so scholars still continue to debate this to this day, right? Whether the Royal Proclamation is a form of recognizing rights to land or a mechanism to dispossess. It's a little bit of both, I'd say. And so that's kind of the interesting position that Canada occupies with respect to Indigenous nations is it knows it can't just take this land, right? And so it has to undertake this practice that it seeks to sort of mobilize to distinguish itself from the violence taking place south of the border. Well, of course, we know there's violence taking place here as well. But really tries to use treaty as that sort of mechanism to facilitate the removal of land. But, if those rights didn't exist, if our inherent rights to the land were never a factor, it wouldn't have had to negotiate. Canada wouldn't have had to negotiate treaties to begin with, and also still wouldn't need treaty partners at a lot of these negotiating tables. So treaties have this, again, really complex position for a lot of Indigenous people where they both represent that not a source of rights at all, but an affirmation of those rights and something that we're, not willing to relinquish just because of the way that they've been sort of perpetually misinhabited by Canada. Like they still have a deeper significance, I think, at a community level than I ever see in academia, right?
For sure. Yeah, definitely 100%. And that's sort of the world I grew up in, hearing my father, my uncles, and some of the old people in my community speak about treaty in context, the bigger picture in terms of our perspective. And, again, that peace and diplomacy project, nationhood project, in terms of, not wanting to compromise, but at the same time wanting to engage in a diplomatic project, right? And in my mind, like diplomacy is so much different than surrendering. Like diplomacy is so much different than being conquered because we're politically in a relationship where we're being diplomatic, but also not, not yielding, right? We're having a conversation. And that's something that I always feel like needs to be emphasized is that diplomacy projects are asserting yourself and getting your people's needs met through a political interaction. But again, the narrative is like, oh, you surrendered, or no, Canada's boss, or why are you still talking about sovereignty when obviously, the economy, settler colonialism's here to stay. But in my mind, it's like, no, like we have every right to engage in diplomacy and assert ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think sometimes, in a sense, we need to decolonize our own understandings of treaty. Like many of us, and, I think sometimes how we'll approach the idea of treaty is through this sort of pragmatic approach where it's like, okay, that might have made sense at the time, but given the asymmetries, why do they have any significance left? Well, they have incredible significance for, the power that they hold, both in terms of how we have always understood them as Indigenous people, but the continuity that with which we've approached them, right? We don't do a lot to sort of alter our treaties in response to every sort of changing social and political and economic whim. I mean, many communities are taking up treaty implementation and calling it treaty implementation in ways that I might question, whether that aligns with the vision of treaty that their ancestors entered into. And that's actually precisely what I mean, is that sometimes we've internalized these sorts of frames of, okay, treaty means advocacy in these defined policy areas as articulated by Canada, and you have to work in relation to the provinces and the federal government and industry, which has suddenly somehow become a treaty partner, as has the provinces.
So wild. I'm glad you recognized that and brought that up.
We have to constantly, and I think what I'm just kind of responding to from your comment is like, stay grounded in our own knowledge of treaty and what we've always known it to be, and not allow the version of treaty that Canada has sort of enacted to inform how we think about it, because it's actually it does a lot of damage, like when you approach treaty in those terms.
For sure. I love you bringing that up, because like in the prairie is like, obviously, like nutrient and potash is like, one of the biggest economic organizations right now, and it's sort of interesting to see how much weight they pull in this province. But also, like you're on point, like you're basically highlighting how settler colonialism is determining the political conversation and the diplomatic conversation. And I mean, I don't want to like step on people's toes, but there is certain groups of leaders who will fall victim to that, and operate in those meeting spaces from the perspective we're talking about, which is a perspective of compromise, not a perspective of assertion.
And that's why I think you can't call anything treaty implementation. Like I try and make distinctions between like critical approaches to treaty implementation, where people are sort of embedding it in a more resurgence framework. We're seeing a resurgence of practices of treaty making that pre-existed and exist autonomously from the settler state. And so one example is the Buffalo Treaty. We're seeing this revitalization of this practice of treaty, and Leroy Littlebear, Tasha Hubbard are doing amazing work on this. And that treaty brings together nations from across Canada and the US, and is really not concerned with federal or state representatives and what they have to say about it. So I think that's a really interesting, we are seeing a lot more moves towards this sort of grassroots, not politically driven treaty implementation efforts and treaty advocacy efforts, where communities are trying to, fund and resource the work towards, strategies that are deeply embedded in a more, I think, grassroots approach to treaty, right? Having treaty talks and holding, this gathering this summer around the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, and trying to theorize how to mobilize collectively against some of these things that impact us all. Right?
For sure. I like how you're breaking that down, and I guess that leads us into the next question too, in terms of how do like these distinguished like Treaty 1 to 11, these like pre-Confederation treaties differ then from these modern sort of capitalist economic relationships that are being called treaties with the Canadian state?
Yeah, I mean, these agreements, they're really, they're, a lot of them will combine aspects of, self-government, or they'll offer some form of recognition of rights or recognition of self-government at these negotiation tables, and then also entail, agreements around the land and non-assertion of rights to the land, or the ceding of rights to the land, whatever language they're using now. It's constantly changing, but nevertheless, they involve a delegated form of political authority. They often involve permanent dispossession of land and the future rights of children who might enjoy those lands, human and non-human. And so for me, that's not something I would ever call a treaty. I think, the language and the rhetoric of treaty gets used, like I said, often unproblematically in ways that actually serve to mask and disguise this host of violences that's being committed against Indigenous people and our relationships to the territories. So I think that, again, just always approaching that language of treaty critically and, questioning what what are we actually talking about here? Because there's a lot of things being called treaty that, don't actually parallel. I hate to use the sort of cheesy language of the spirit and intent of, but that's what we've always heard and what we've always been told. And there's just sort of, again, there's a power, I think, in that continuity.
Yeah, spirit and intent's being used pretty broadly, right? And kind of like capitalizing off our philosophy and like our spirituality, obviously. But it's almost like in those conversations and that type of relationship, there's like this specter of capitalism that kind of shows up, right? Like to flip the script on that phrase that a lot of leftists use, but it's like embodied like this very real, like ongoing settler colonial relationship, political and economic dynamic, legal dynamic. Like there's so much like settler colonial legal glue that holds it together that, people are investing time in. And that's why I wanted you on, was to highlight, that, hey, this is a problem. This is what's, a big issue here. And I guess I wanted to help out our U.S. listeners in context to this conversation too, in that the Royal Proclamation, the British Crown, the Royal Proclamation that gave, like, recognized Indigenous ownership to land so they could secure their negotiation practice with us, also existed prior to the American Revolutionary War. And there's conversation, I know Rick on Decolonized Buffalo talks about this, where he says that was part of the reason why the Americans wanted to go to war with the British Crown, was because they did not want to engage in treaty making practices with Indigenous nations south of what would become the U.S. border. So there's very real, like, historical colonial dynamics playing out. But with that being said, like you brought up with the Buffalo Treaty, Indigenous people, we've naturally always had this peace and diplomacy project where we did engage in treaty making. It's not something that was foreign. Like, we were capable of doing it. And we were good at it. Like, if you really put it into context, like, the British Empire was huge. And then how was it that we managed to, like, lock them into a treaty relationship with us, which is on the, like, way on the, like, frontier of their empire? Because they were in India, they were in Africa, they're in they're in Australia. Technically the empire was huge. But here we are on the prairie engaging in peace and diplomacy with one of these big, this empire ultimately. So it's relative to the U.S. conversation too, in context to treaty, in context to relationship building and peace and diplomacy. And I guess that leads us into our next question, is how do we contextualize the relationship with settlers through this treaty lens then? Like, who are we and how do we relate to one another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think over time, one thing that's interesting that happens is that treaty sort of gains a life of its own, right? So it's initially negotiated by particular representatives of the British Crown who are sent out, who make these, commitments, and then it's really becomes a huge mess around who then is responsible for the implementation of treaty, right? As this ongoing relation. So Canada, well, the Crown at the time, and then, Canada inherits these obligations, or gets delegated these obligations, but really, is looking to cut back on these economic obligations, really from the moment of treaty that have been entered into towards Indigenous people. And over time, we then see shifts in how it tries to kind of contain that, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, sort of situating it as a one-term transaction, saying you've been paid out, not fulfilling the full extent of agricultural promises, of medical promises, of really any obligations that are entered into, establishing a school on each reserve. Yeah. Obviously, we know that doesn't happen. Residential schools get established instead and become this mechanism of genocide. And so there's all these sort of moves that take place over time. And we see those, scholars have traced those, how treaty then sort of gets turned into something that for Canada has very little ongoing material significance. It's a historical event and transaction that occurred, and perhaps there's some residual obligations, but we'll just, create these claims processes to attend to them, and i.e. kind of complete the transaction in that sense, right?
Yeah.
We see treaty sort of occupying little more, I think, for many Canadians and settlers, non-Indigenous people, than a symbolic value, right? This thing that once was, and, maybe if we become reconciled, we'll get back to that sort of warm and fuzzy relationship again. But it is that sort of, I think, pinnacle of, or that sort of symbolic representation of the peace and friendship that Canada so liberally tries to claim, right? But we do have scholars that sort of trace the ways in which treaty appears over time. And I was just at Congress of the Humanities and the Social of this Humanities and Social Sciences, and I heard some really, really great presentations from actually IGov alumni, Corey Snellgrove and John Carlson. I don't know if you know either of them, but they were really talking about, and they've been doing really great work, both of them, on thinking through also and talking about the ways that all of these forms of all of these power structures must be understood, as co-constitutive with colonialism. So, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, the sort of social world, in addition to the legal and political analysis of treaty, has played an important role in how they've gotten taken up and how they sort of reappear, particularly at the moment of reconciliation, right? When things are coming to a head with the Harper government. And I think their analysis is incredibly interesting because it points us to the social life of treaty rather than, I think the spaces where it's typically been taken up in academia, which has been in the sort of legal and political vein. But absolutely, treaty, I think, is something that informs what we see as possible, how we interpret our interactions in the world around us, how we interpret, Canada as an entity and its relationships with Indigenous people and its own citizens. And so I think, just drawing attention to some of that and thinking more deeply about the sort of capitalist relations that are underpinning, I think, both some people's moves towards treaty, but also some people's refusal to particular treaty-based offerings by Canada is really, really insightful as well.
Yeah, for sure. I really like how you gave us that panoramic view of that too. Because in my mind, like treaty discourse, treaty relationship, treaty diplomacies, it's really like a flex we have as Indigenous people. Like we could flex that on the state. And we're good at that. Like I feel like when crisis happens or there's a flashpoint event, people will be quick to, bring in nation to nation, bring in sovereignty and flex really good. But when it comes time to like the diplomatic relations, things tend to kind of crumble. But we do still recognize and hear nation to nation references, sovereignty references amongst grassroots. And and for me, I really want to foster that and build that because ideally it could lead into, this diplomacy that is a bit more assertive, that does change the political economic landscape of our traditional territories that are still ours, right?
Absolutely. I always get asked that question because I teach, I teach governance courses in community settings as well, and outside of academia. And one of the biggest things that people ask me is, how do I then work towards this in a non-capitalist form, right? How do I think about treaty implementation outside of these sorts of, forms of, these deeply colonial and capitalist sort of political and social offerings that are being made, these forms of relation that are being kind of advanced to our communities and whatnot. And so, I think it's often hard because you have that very crucial question of how to resource these things. But that's why I think some of this new work is so interesting, because they're really pointing to the ways in which people are drawing or are thinking about self-determination, thinking about refusal in ways that really, really subvert those forms, those capitalist forms, and show, you know, case studies of how this is actually transpiring and taking place. I, like you, think that treaty is probably one of the most unifying aspects of our subjectivities, like our collective identity as Indigenous people in the prairies. And I think that we could actually build on that. And that can be really empowering to think about strategies of unifying and moving forward collectively, right? We've always had that shared sort of understanding that they're incredibly important. Those of us that have grown up in the prairies have been corrected about how we talk about treaty a lot. And so I think we're very mindful and careful of that, and it retains that really incredible like importance. And that's not nothing, right? I think that can be something that we can use to really carve out, you know, or inform our own sense of, you know, what a collective kind of Indigenous sense of identity might be like in the prairies and might entail, while also recognizing the problems that we can get into when, you know, particular identities get crystallized and aren't open to discussion and contestation and debate and whatnot, right?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Like, this is why I wanted you on. and also,
I was so happy that you invited me.
Yeah. Well, also, I've been trying to get Corey Snellgrove on. You made reference to him, and you know, it's an ongoing conversation we've had over the last, since Radical Narrative started. It was to get, you know, Corey Snellgrove on, and I think you're just solidifying that, because I almost had him on before, and he. I don't know. Like, I think he just feels uncomfortable with being on the podcast and speaking, but I want him to own his words, because it does sound like he's doing amazing work.
Do one with him and John. They're well, now they have to, because I gave the shout out. And
they have to
just say you've been told. And
I literally just text them.
They will follow suit. I'm sure.
Yeah, I literally just texted them and gave them the option. I was like, "Do you want to jump on a podcast with John?" So we'll see what they say. But yeah, I really love this conversation. I love what you're highlighting, and for our listeners, some of this is going to be news to them. It's going to be, you know, they're going to be learning a lot, because Radical Narrative is all about the brain gains, and you're speaking about this very like unique dynamic, and I feel we're probably speaking around it because we know what we're referring to, but what's the best way to explain like the nation to nation relationship then, in context to in context through treaty?
Yeah, so I think when people are talking about nation to nation, they're typically talking about, you know, a relationship of political non-subordination or non-hierarchy. So you talked about these diplomatic practices where we enter into those relationships of care, mutuality, trust, support, and even dependency, right? Where we could depend on one another in time of need. But for Indigenous people, that didn't entail a desire to become subordinate or lesser than the other entity or nation. And so, you know, we use that language of nation to nation to really evidence or illustrate the desire to meet halfway, to be understood as equals, to be on equal you know, levels of political authority, where multiple political entities and legal entities can coexist in a shared space. It's a different vision of coexistence, right? Where it's non-hierarchical and doesn't involve those forms of marginalization and dispossession. And so that's the sort of language that I think, you know, gets used a lot with respect to treaty, particularly following, you know, the 80s and the repatriation of the Constitution, when we start to see Indian and Native being used interchangeably with new terminology like First Nations, right? And so First Nations comes about at a particular time when Indian or Native people are trying to sort of assert the same level of political authority, and in fact, probably a heightened level of political authority than that which is being asserted by Quebec when it's making assertions to being a separate nation or a distinct nation, right? So what in response, we have a lot of First Nations or Indigenous leaders saying, no, well, if you're a nation, then we're also a nation because we precede anyone who now calls this their home. And in fact, we're the First Nations. So we see that language used for some time. And I think from there, the sort of language of asserting nationhood starts to gain momentum.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I always make that reference too. And it's kind of funny because I feel like it throws people a curveball. And the reference I always say is like Indigenous roots are always deepest. Like we've been here the longest. Like we're always the first original peoples. And I know like people like Sharon Van and, you know, a lot of treaty lawyers, people who operate from treaty perspective make reference to basically us being here first, even the language being here first.
That's right. Yeah. And I'll just say too, though, like the language, I think, is meant to assert a political authority and a sort of linear like primacy. But also that, I mean, I just want to note that it's not meant to sort of replicate our desire to look like or behave like nation states. You know, the sort of Euro-Western conception of a nation state isn't something that a lot of Indigenous communities try and aspire to, but sometimes these terms like nation or sovereignty, even though they're Euro-Western terms, they serve as sort of like enabling function for Indigenous people to be able to, you know, utilize that language to assert our own relationships and responsibilities and rights in a way that's legible to Canada, you know, and that's going to be received and, you know, be strategically, I think, advantageous. So, you know, just because we might assert ourselves at our nationhood, it doesn't always mean that we're trying to kind of mirror or replicate that, you know, that anthropocentric notion of the nation state, right, as some cohesive entity. In fact, many of our members like are increasingly questioning those terms, right? Terms like the nation, this a sovereign entity, and things like that, and whether those are in fact applicable and representative of what we vision for our communities.
Yeah, for sure. And those were conversations too that we did hear growing up in terms of like, well, like we don't necessarily want like what Europeans would call a state, right? And how they define that in terms of its foundations. But also interestingly enough, like socially, the conversation that some people are picking up on when it comes to sovereignty, Indigenous autonomy, Indigenous nationhood, even land back, is that, well, all you Native people want an ethno state. Like, what are you going to do with us then? Like, like, are you sending us back to Europe and things like that? But for me, it's like, our people already developed the answer, and it was treaty. It was peace and diplomacy. It was having this diplomatic project in play constantly that recognized both our parties to be able to coexist with one another. They were like, we didn't enter a treaty with wanting to create an ethno state. like I don't know, like they're putting words in our mouth with that first and foremost. But like the answer is, you know, treaty.
I mean, in the prairies, I feel like the answer is always treaty. And that's why, like, I encounter skeptics in academia a lot, right? Because it has mixed sort of uptake in academia. And I'm like, just come to Saskatchewan, you'll understand, right? Why, for me, everything boils down to treaty, but
yeah, it does. It literally does, especially on the landscape, right? Like peaceful coexistence, sharing resources, sharing land, right? And that was our intention, but we don't see it. And then people are saying, well, how do we solve this problem? And it is, it really is. Well, we sat down, we had this conversation in 1876, and I don't want to sit down and have it again because we never saw the full implementation of that intention play out.
No, I know. We don't need these new offerings every few years that are still just the same tired old self-government offering. I mean, we already have treaties, and they can be renewed, right? They can be renewed, and we can revisit those relationships. Obviously, they haven't been working for all parties to them. And now we're seeing people, you know, recognize that even within, you know, Canada's own institutions with the Robinson-Huron, Robinson-Superior Treaty, you know, where they recently, in the past few years, well, in 2018, I believe, the Sudbury Superior Court ruled that the First Nation who had signed First Nations who had signed on to those treaties should in fact receive increases in the annuities since the treaty signing in 1850. And of course that case has been under appeal, and they're trying to figure out a process for settling those sorts of claims. But I think it's a really interesting precedent that acknowledges treaties not as transaction but as relationship, and not just any relationship, but ones that are meant to grow and evolve over time. And the failure to do that, is going to continue to have legal repercussions for Canada, as that recognition that treaties were not land surrenders continues to grow, right? Eventually, it's not just acknowledged in textbooks anymore and in the social world, but Canada's going to have to reckon with that in its own legal and political institutions.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a question for you, and it may be hard for academics to answer, but but I want to ask you then is, in terms of like treaty nation to nation relationship, like how it has very real political implications that we talked about, very real social implications. Like what's the whole, how do you see this whole relationship playing out? Like what are the economic, social, even environmental implications today if like this diplomatic nation to nation treaty relationship was fully realized? How would it look in your mind?
I mean, I think between governments, it would entail, the redistribution of political authority, jurisdiction, tax and revenue sharing, the implementation of Indigenous orders of, law, governance, education, healthcare within our areas. But of course, that doesn't happen seamlessly. That requires, that's a long-term transitional project that requires changes in funding arrangements, the building up of capacity at community levels, and all of those sorts of structural shifts. I think environmentally, this is a place where I see a lot of promise for us to sort of mobilize around, because treaty obviously is not just between human communities. These are treaties made in relation to creation, and for a very particular reason, right? In order so that we can, as Indigenous peoples, we can continue to carry on those relationships with and responsibilities to creation. So what would that look like if we were able to carry those out fully, right? If we were able to enact that freedom in relation to creation. And by freedom, I don't mean, us just being kind of autonomous and separate from the worlds we live in, but actually deeply accountable to and responsible to those worlds. That could have that's not just for Indigenous people. That is something we all need to attend to, as the lands around us are on fire, we're literally seeing things change at such a rapid pace that all of our futures are in question.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. And that's something I always say too, is that, well, treaty is a really great climate change policy because you would have to revisit everything, right? And like, I like how you brought up the fires too, because I think like right now as we're recording this, New York's dealing with the smoke, right? And it's a dense population area, and it's getting a lot of play, but we've been dealing with that smoke for the last like 3 or 4 years now. And it's not just smoke from a forest fire. That's our traditional territories. That's like our people's hunting grounds, trap lines, and their lineages go back to those territories, and they're literally on fire. Right. That's like, and
the animals, right? And the, like everything, it's impacting everything in those territories, the lands, all the living beings, like, and the synergy between, between all of those elements. I think shows or reveals, that the land is one of the most urgent and compelling issues we need to mobilize around, right? And not stop fighting over it. Obviously, we have to keep fighting. That fire is always going to be burning within us as well, to do that work. But I think, having people start to understand the actual long-standing orders that have governed coexistence in those spaces might bring about greater awareness of how we might live in them well today in ways that don't threaten their continuity for future generations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, definitely. One last question about treaty.
Yep.
And I guess this will be giving our like non-Indigenous settler audience some food for thought. How could settlers support Indigenous nationhood?
I think, and there's obviously a host of works out there about, that sort of go in detail on the discourse of allyship. There's a number of sort of toolkits for allies and settlers wanting to do on the ground work that, can help provide them with some really sort of generalizable, I think, guidance on how to undertake, both academic or activist work in relation to Indigenous people that stands to benefit the lives of those that they're working in relation to, right? But for me, I would say just broad strokes. Learn about the particular people whose lands you are on. Learn about those orders of governance, those orders of law that exist there, because those are actually the laws that newcomers should be learning about when they enter into treaty territories. They should be learning about the ways that people have lived in those particular lands for many, many years. And again, a lot of people will just pick up a topic like treaty and think, oh, this is a nice, interesting subject and perhaps something very important to think about. But if you're going to do work on treaty or in relation to treaty, or even in relation to Indigenous peoples and lands, like, do something that stands to benefit those communities. Take action. Don't just, see this as a topic because we have stakes in this, and the way people talk about these things and the way in which people theorize and, present ideas, that actually has a really deep impact. So this isn't just, a topic meant for armchair theorizing.
Yeah.
Indigenous life in Canada, this is a real real matter for many of us. We continue to see the impacts of colonialism, of capitalism, of heteropatriarchy in the world around us, impacting our relationships every day. So I think that's something I always try to stress to settlers who are interested in these topics is think about your stakes, but also think about the fact that there's some of us that have very real felt stakes in this, and you could actually be doing damage, if you don't do it thoughtfully and critically.
For sure. And I would echo that too. And also like carry the project throughout your life. Cause I noticed some settlers will pick this up, pick up the conversation, pick up even the activism. And then all of a sudden, it's gone and they're like working for some company and, it's hindsight. But for us, it's an ongoing thing. Like we grew up in this. It's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing project. It's just not like one semester of an Indigenous studies course. It's a lifelong thing for us. Yeah. Is there any resources or readings you would recommend anybody in context to this conversation?
Yeah. Okay, I think in terms of, I just edited and just submitted the third edition of the book Making Space for Indigenous Feminism. And so there's some really amazing contributors whose work I've been just, saturating myself in. One of the recent books that I've been reading and thinking a lot about is Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard's Rehearsals for Living. And in that, they talk about coalition. They talk about, abolitionism, but they also talk about, how not to just employ these really kind of universal approaches to allyship, how to kind of work towards convergences where they're still deeply embedded in their own identities and cultural practices and things like that. So I think that's like a really interesting idea. The idea of there being multiple sort of rehearsals for us to think about how we might live otherwise. That could also be a really interesting approach to thinking about how to, think about treaty in a different way that's sort of decoupled from the nation state, right? How to live differently in these spaces and live in relation to one another across difference in multiple open-ended ways. And so I think that's what their book, for me really conveys is that there's no like manifesto, or there's no formula necessarily for what working towards transformation has to look like. And it's all going to be contextual and relational. And so that, I really have been enjoying that. And I talked to them about that book for the next edition of Making Space. And I'm so excited to have that in the volume.
Awesome.
Shailene Jobin also has a new book that I want to just plug, because she is an amazing scholar who has just taken up position with the First Nations University of Canada, which is, very close to my heart, because it's on Star Blanket's Urban Reserve. And I remember when we, did the ribbon cutting for that institute, before they even started building the space. And I'm so happy. They're so lucky to have Shailene joining them. But she has a new book out called Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships. And then who else did I want to talk about? I mean, there's a whole bunch of treaty scholars out there. A lot of them are within the sort of Eurocentric tradition of interpretation. And then there's a lot of Indigenous scholars that have sort of laid out what treaty looks like from an Indigenous lens. But the other thing I want to just point to is that, like, the number of amazing creative and innovative works that are coming out of treaty areas by artists and creators and poets. And so there's a whole, host that have come out in the past year. Books like, Emily Riddle has a poetry collection called The Big Melt, and Jessica John's Bad Cree have been really interesting. And of course, always new works coming out of the prairies in those avenues as well. So I just want to point to, not just academic works, but other works that we're seeing that are really incredible by and for treaty people as well.
I'm glad you plugged Emily Riddle too, because I've been reaching out to her about the podcast too, off and on.
Absolutely. I love Emily's work and have always been a huge supporter of it. I think that, some of the most interesting insights and knowledges are coming out of spaces that, again, are sometimes academic adjacent, but sometimes non-academic. We have our own theorists. We have our own, thinkers. And I actually think this is something that we need to build up as Indigenous people, is resourcing our own thinkers outside of academia. Because when it's always wedded to academia, then the output's going to look a particular way. But, it's not just one person anymore that's responsible for, contemplating, thinking about, organizing, strategizing, and advocating for, treaty. Like, it's not all the responsibility of chiefs. There's people that are taking on all these different positions, and we have incredible knowledge bases and theorists in the prairies that I think it's our job to uphold and support, right?
Awesome.
And center.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. So what are your future plans then? Your big goal in terms of where you want to take this work, or what you want to do with your whole trajectory here in life?
I mean, I want to write my own manuscript on treaty. So I started out in academia and just started saying yes to a number of really important projects that, were relevant at the time for particular reasons. But what I'm trying to do now is sort of take steps to clear out the space. So, the things I want to say, I can present in one coherent volume. Hopefully it'll be somewhat coherent, but so I want to write my own manuscript on treaty. I have a volume I'm in the late stages of working on, and it's my late great uncle, our former national chief, Noel Starblanket. It's his stories that he shared with me in the years leading up to his passing, and I've been putting those together, and I'm still working on the framing, but that's the next project that I'm going to get out, and then turning to treaty. And I also recently took up, UVic is now housing the Journal of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, so the NACE journal. So I'll just, anyone who's interested in submitting to NACE, definitely, send us your articles. Also creative works. We're open to a number of different formats, languages and styles. And so, co-editing that with Heidi Stark, who's also here at UVic.
Cool. Yeah. Nice. Potential leads for more episodes.
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
All right. Well, thanks, Mylan. I really appreciate the chance to, reconnect and to hear more about the work going on with this podcast. I think it's so important to have all of these different venues, and hopefully our paths can continue to intersect.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, it's great
All
to
right.
have you. I appreciate you. And yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you.